CBC News all this week taking the pulse of Canadians with a poll that CBC News commissioned with a view toward the federal election in October. There have been some very interesting findings today that we've been examining, looking at Indigenous voters. 24% of decided or leaning voters, Indigenous voters, say that today they would cast their ballots for the Liberals, compared to 41% of Indigenous voters who supported the Liberals in 2015. This is among respondents who were able to recall how they voted. That is a drop of 17 points. One of the very interesting numbers that we're going to talk about in more detail with a special guest this morning, Sheila North, former Manitoba Grand Chief, who is in Winnipeg this morning. We often turn to Sheila for her perspective, and looking forward to our conversation this morning. Welcome back.
Thank you, Heather. Good morning.
So we had that number to start. I'm going to bring up another one that caught my eye, Sheila. 6 out of 10. Here's a big number. Of Indigenous respondents say they do not feel respected by the government and as a result are abandoning support for the Liberal Party. So let's begin, if we could, with your reaction to that big number and whether that's something that you are seeing or hearing reflected in your immediate circles.
Yes, that's exactly what I've been hearing and feeling. I think that there is, of course, some disappointment that happened in the last year, in the last few years, and especially in the last year. And I think that that set a tone on how some Indigenous people feel in this country by the government. And I think if you would have polled them during the previous government, it probably would have been worse. But still, today, I think it's still as bad because people realize that it's not the government that's going to improve lives. It's going to be their own communities.
Well, it was interesting. Someone to whom we spoke specifically in our reporting earlier referred to it as buyer's remorse. What has been responsible? What are the particular things that have caused the support to slide?
Well, I think when we look at the real day-to-day bread and butter issues on the ground in our First Nations, but also in urban areas, we don't see significant changes to our lives. We don't see significant improvements. And people talk about this is going to take time. But, you know, there was a sense of urgency during that last election that there was going to be some changes that would be beneficial to Canadians, but also Indigenous people. And not seeing that happen in a big way has really hindered the relationship, especially on how strong it was at the beginning with the words around reconciliation. And so there is definitely a feeling of disappointment and even disenchantment.
That's interesting. I mean, the government has talked so much about reconciliation, about this relationship being the most important existing between Ottawa, the federal government, and Canada's Indigenous peoples. I mean, do you think it was a sense of expectations being too high?
That, and also I think that this government and the Prime Minister didn't realize how hard it actually is to get to that point. And also there's a combination of a lot of other things, including the fact that there are many Indigenous people, leaders and advocates and grassroots people that have been watching the governments for generations, and then look back at history, see the long litany of broken promises along the way. And so there's lots of skepticism, but also lots of intelligent Indigenous people that are now saying that the government can no longer assume its role as the one to deliver programs and services for us. We have to do it on our own. So you're seeing and hearing a huge move towards that, even amongst the First Nations leadership, I would say.
I'm interested in how that would look. I mean, it's interesting because it seems unlikely that any government or any party right now would do more than what the Liberal government has been doing and has promised over these years. It seems to be such a priority for the Liberal Party, and yet still far from what you say is needed. So,
well, I think one of the biggest things that we've heard in the last while, and that conversation has sort of dwindled a little bit, I think, but, you know, starting to dismantle the Indian Act so we can start looking together what that actually looks like. Is there another order of government for First Nations? I think that that's a huge move. Like even within the regions, they're starting to move away from the PTOs that are funded by the government and starting to look internally and grouping as treaty groups. And so we're seeing that in Manitoba and in other areas. I know we don't have treaties all across Canada, but we're starting to see those groups forming, and it's a blast from the past that's coming back, and the movement is going towards that way. And any government that starts to realize that and start to capture that and trying to work with that, to be an ally rather than the overseer, I think that's where we're all heading, and any government that can capture that will go a long way.
So how do you think this is all going to play out then this fall with Indigenous voters casting ballots?
Well, what I'm hearing is a lot of empathy, a lot of anger, and a lot of disappointment. And they're saying anything but Greens, or anything but Conservatives or the Liberals. And so I hear a lot of people saying they're voting for Green, even though they haven't, and Independent, even though they haven't fully, looked into what the Greens stand for. So I think that there is an interesting perspective now. I think people are scorned and disappointed that this government didn't actually follow through to everything that they were saying. Even the inquiry report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, while it was complete and it was finished, and there was some good recommendations and some good findings, I think that the fact that Indigenous women and girls who brought this issue to the forefront weren't included from the beginning, and so that left a lot of bad taste in a lot of people's minds and mouths. And what happened to Jody Wilson-Raybould as well got a lot of people really angry, because they saw that the real attitude towards Indigenous women and girls especially, but also Indigenous people in general, and so there was a lot of disappointment there.
On Jody Wilson-Raybould, yeah, one specific question on that. 46% of respondents say they were very angry with the Liberal government for how it was handled. So that we'll see whether memories are long on that particular issue. Very interesting, and I'm sure not the only time we'll have a conversation on this as we get into the campaign in earnest. But thanks very much for the time this morning, as always, Sheila. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Heather. Nice talking to you.
Sheila North, who is in Winnipeg, former Manitoba Grand Chief, as we look at the poll. And again, a few more details about it. CBC News teaming up with Public Square Research and Maru Blue. From May the 31st to June the 10th, 4,500 eligible voters across the country were surveyed about what they want, what they fear, the direction the country is headed. There are stories online at CBCNews.ca.